October 23, 1935, 22:12. The Palace Chop House, Newark, New Jersey. The smell of stale beer and expensive cigars hung heavy in the back room. Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, sat with his ledger, his mind a frantic calculator of numbers and names. Outside, the rain turned the Newark streets into a dark mirror. A sudden, sharp clack echoed from the hallway, the sound of a bathroom door swinging shut. It was a mundane sound, but to a man with a $10,000 bounty on his head, it sounded like a hammer being cocked. "Something's off," Schultz muttered, his hand drifting toward the .38 tucked into his waistband. His associates, Lulu Rosenkrantz and Abe Landau, didn't even look up from their drinks. They were comfortable. That was their first mistake. To understand how the most feared man in New York ended up bleeding out in a New Jersey steakhouse, we have to go back 72 hours. Back to the quiet, high-ceilinged kitchen of his private residence. Schultz was a man of patterns. He trusted the same tailor, the same bodyguards, and for 6 years, the same housekeeper. A quiet, grey-haired woman named Elena. She was the ghost in his halls, the one who knew how he liked his coffee and which shirts hid his shoulder holster best. She was part of the furniture, and in the world of the mob, the furniture isn't supposed to move. 3 nights ago at 02:00 a.m., Schultz was headed to the kitchen for a glass of milk to soothe his ulcer. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He stopped when he saw a sliver of light bleeding through the heavy oak door leading to the servants' quarters. He peered through the gap. Elena was there, but she wasn't alone. Behind the industrial stove, silhouetted against the moonlight of the back porch, stood a man Schultz didn't recognize. A man in a charcoal overcoat, handing Elena a thick, cream-colored envelope. The Dutchman felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He didn't burst in. He watched. He saw Elena take the envelope, her hands trembling, and whisper something that looked like a prayer. The stranger nodded, tipped his hat, and vanished into the shadows of the garden. The betrayal of a soldier is expected. The betrayal of the woman who washes your blood-stained shirts. That is a death sentence. Schultz didn't kill her then. He realized that if Elena was talking, she wasn't talking to the police. She was talking to the commission. And that meant the hit wasn't coming. It was already in the house. October 21st, 1935, 02:15. The Schultz residence, Bronx, NY. Schultz retreated into the darkness of the hallway, his footsteps silent on the plush Persian rug. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. In the world of the 1930s syndicate, information was the only currency that mattered more than lead. If Elena, a woman who had seen him at his most vulnerable, was meeting strangers in the dead of night, the walls of his fortress were effectively glass. He spent the rest of the night sitting in a leather armchair in his study, a glass of bootleg rye untouched on the desk. He thought about his rise. Arthur Flegenheimer hadn't become Dutch Schultz by being soft. He had outlasted the Rothsteins and the Diamonds. He had survived the tax evasion charges brought by Thomas Dewey. But those were external threats. This was intimate. "Who was he, Eleanor?" he whispered to the empty room. The next morning the sun rose over the Bronx with a deceptive brilliance. Schultz watched Eleanor from the breakfast table. She moved with her usual efficiency, setting down a plate of soft-boiled eggs. Her face was a mask of stoic servitude. But Schultz noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she poured the coffee. He noticed how she avoided his gaze, her eyes darting toward the heavy velvet curtains. "Everything all right, Elena?" Schultz asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You look like you didn't sleep much. Bad dreams?" Eleanor froze for a fraction of a second. "Just the wind, Mr. Schultz. The old house creaks." "Yeah," Schultz replied, leaning back. "Everything creaks when it gets old. Sometimes it just breaks." He let the silence hang. He wanted her to feel the weight of his suspicion, to see if she would crack. But she simply nodded and retreated to the kitchen. Schultz knew he couldn't trust his own men to investigate this. If Eleanor was compromised, his inner circle might be too. He needed to know what was in that envelope. He needed to know if he was looking at his funeral arrangements. He waited until she went to the market at 10 a.m. He entered her small, austere room. It smelled of lavender and old paper. He tore the room apart with clinical precision. He found the envelope hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. When he opened it, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't money. It wasn't a map. It was a series of photographs. Photos of Schultz entering the Palace Chop House in Newark. Photos of his car, and a handwritten note that simply read, "The window in the back remains unlatched." The housekeeper wasn't just an informant. She was the locksmith for his executioners. But as Schultz looked closer at the photos, he realized the man in the charcoal overcoat from the night before was someone he had seen in a very different context, at a funeral for a high-ranking Luciano loyalist. October 21st, 1935, 14th Farn, a private phone booth, Manhattan. Schultz stepped out of the shadows of a cigar shop, his hat pulled low. He didn't use his driver. He took a cab, then another. He was playing the long game of evasion, a skill honed over a decade of dodging federal agents and rival gunmen. He dropped a nickel into the slot of a payphone and dialed a number that didn't exist on any official record. "It's the Dutchman," he said when the line picked up. "I need a name. Charcoal overcoat, silver tie pin, looks like he spends more time in a gym than a social club. Works for the Italian side of the street." The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Dutch, you're supposed to be laying low. Dewey is breathing down your neck." "Forget Dewey," Schultz snapped. "My own kitchen is bugged, and my help is opening the windows for the wolves. Give me the name, or I start burning down warehouses until someone talks." 10 minutes later, he had it. Charlie the Bug Workman, one of the most clinical killers for Murder Inc. The realization hit Schultz like a physical blow. If Workman was involved, this wasn't just a local dispute over numbers or territory. This was a sanctioned hit by the Commission, the board of directors for the National Crime Syndicate. Lucky Luciano and Maya Lansky had finally decided that Dutch Schultz was too loud, too erratic, and too dangerous for business. Schultz returned home, his mind racing. He looked at Elena as she prepared dinner, a simple roast chicken. He felt a strange mix of rage and curiosity. Why her? Why the woman who had lived under his roof for years? He cornered her in the pantry. The space was tight, smelling of flour and dried herbs. He didn't pull a gun. He just stood in the doorway, blocking the light. "Elena," he said softly, "the man in the garden. Tell me his name and maybe you get to leave the city tonight." She dropped the jar she was holding. It shattered, spreading white flour across the floor like fresh snow. She didn't scream. She sank to her knees, her face collapsing into a mask of pure terror. "They have my son, Arthur," she sobbed, using his birth name, a name no one used anymore. "They said if I didn't help, they'd send him back to me in pieces. They knew everything. They knew when you slept, when you ate. They knew I loved him more than I feared you." Schultz realized he was being hunted by an organization that knew his every weakness. But Eleanor's next words changed everything. "It's not just the Newark hit, Arthur. They aren't waiting for the restaurant. They're coming here. Tonight." October 21st, 1935, 23:30, the Schultz residence. The Bronx was quiet, but to Schultz, every rustle of the wind felt like a footstep. He had sent his main guards away on an errand to Jersey, realizing he couldn't be sure who was still on his payroll. He was alone in the dark house with Eleanor, who was curled in a chair in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes vacant. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the dining room, a Thompson submachine gun resting across his knees. He was a king in a crumbling castle. At 11:45 p.m., a black sedan drifted slowly past the house, its headlights extinguished. It stopped 3 houses down. Schultz watched from behind the heavy drapes. 4 silhouettes emerged. They moved with the synchronized grace of professionals. These weren't street thugs. These were the combination boys. He heard the faint snick of the back kitchen window sliding up, the window Elena was supposed to leave unlatched. Schultz felt a grim sense of satisfaction. They were predictable. He stepped into the hallway, his boots making no sound on the wood. He waited until he heard the heavy thud of a man landing on the linoleum floor of the kitchen. "Now," he whispered. He didn't shoot. Not yet. He threw a heavy glass decanter into the far corner of the dining room. The sound of breaking glass acted like a magnet. The first assassin rounded the corner, suppressed pistol raised. Schultz met him with a burst from the Thompson. The roar of the gun was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in strobing bursts of white light. The man was thrown back into the kitchen, his chest a ruin. Schultz didn't stop. He moved to the kitchen door and fired another spray through the wood. He heard a cry of pain and the sound of heavy bodies retreating through the window. He stepped into the kitchen. The first assassin was dead. Schultz flipped him over. It wasn't Workman. It was a low-level triggerman, a scout. He looked at Elena. She hadn't moved. She was staring at the dead man on her floor. "Get up," Schultz commanded. "We're leaving." "Where?" she whispered. "To the only place they think they've already caught me," Schultz said, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. "Newark. If the Commission wants a war, I'll give them one. But first, I'm going to kill Thomas Dewey." Schultz's plan was insane. He thought that by assassinating the special prosecutor, he would become too big to hit. He didn't realize that this decision was exactly what would sign his death warrant with the other bosses. October 22, 1935. Oro 4, en route to New Jersey. The rain began to fall in earnest as Schultz's car crossed the George Washington Bridge. He was driving himself, Eleanor huddled in the passenger seat, trembling. He had forced her to come, not as a hostage, but as a reminder. She was the one who had let the devil in, and now she would see what the devil did when he was cornered. "You should have told me, Elena," Schultz said, his eyes fixed on the slick road. "I could have protected your son. I have more money than Luciano has sins." "Money doesn't stop men like that," she replied, her voice stronger now, edged with bitterness. "You think you're a god because people jump when you bark, but to them, you're just a loud noise that needs to be silenced. They don't hate you, Arthur. They're just bored of you." The insult stung more than the bullets. Schultz gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was the man who controlled the numbers racket in Harlem. He had built an empire on beer during Prohibition. He wasn't noise. He arrived at a safe house in Newark, a nondescript apartment above a laundry. He called his most loyal lieutenants, Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, and his accountant, Otto Abadaba Berman. Berman was a genius, a man who could manipulate the betting odds of any race in the country. He was the brains of the operation, and Schultz needed brains now more than ever. "The Commission is moving against us," Schultz told them, as they gathered in the dim light of the apartment. "They sent workmen to my house. They're using my own staff against me." Landau spat on the floor. "So what's the move, boss? We go to Brooklyn and start hitting their social clubs?" "No," Schultz said, leaning over a map of New York. "We do the one thing they told me not to do. We kill Dewey. Once the prosecutor is dead, the city goes into a panic. The heat will be so high that Luciano won't be able to breathe, let alone run a hit on me. I'll be the only one who knows how to navigate the chaos." Berman looked worried. "Dutch, the Commission specifically forbade hitting a lawman. It brings too much heat. If you do this, they'll never stop coming." "They're already coming, Otto," Schultz roared, slamming his fist on the table. "I saw it in my own kitchen. I saw the shadow of the noose." While Schultz planned his strike against Dewey, he was unaware that Elena had managed to slip a small handwritten note into the pocket of a delivery boy who brought them food that morning. The note had only one address: the Palace Chop House. October 22, 1935, 14-2, the Safe House, Newark. Otto Berman sat in the corner, his slide rule and ledgers spread out before him. He was a man of logic, of cold, hard probability. He watched Schultz pace the room like a caged tiger. To Berman, the math didn't add up. Schultz was fighting a war on two fronts, the law and the syndicate. In every simulation Berman ran in his head, the result was the same: 0. "Dutch," Berman said softly, "look at the numbers. We have 20 men we can trust. Luciano has 500. The police have 5,000. This isn't a fight. It's a mathematical certainty of failure." Schultz turned on him, his eyes bloodshot. "Since when do you care about odds, Otto? You're the one who told me we could rig the Harlem Treasury. You're the one who made us millions." "I rig games we can win, Dutch," Berman replied. "You're trying to rig a funeral." Schultz ignored him and turned to Eleanor. She was sitting by the window, watching the rain. He felt a strange urge to justify himself to her. You think I'm the monster, don't you? Because I killed that man in my kitchen? He was there to kill me. In this world, it's him or me. There is no middle ground. Elena didn't look at him. The monster isn't the man who kills, Arthur. It's the man who thinks he's the only one who matters. You didn't even ask my son's name. Schultz paused. The room went silent. The tension was a physical weight. For a moment, the beer baron looked small. Then the mask of the gangster slid back into place. His name doesn't matter, Schultz said. What matters is the hit. We move to the Palace Chop House tonight. We'll use the back room as our command center. From there, we coordinate the Dewey hit. He didn't realize that by choosing the Palace Chop House, he was walking into the very trap he had discovered in Elena's Bible. He thought he was being clever by going to the place they expected him to be later, thinking he had cleared the threat at his house. He thought he had outsmarted the Commission, but the Commission didn't play chess. They played demolition. As they packed their bags, Lulu Rosenkrantz checked his weapon. He looked at Schultz and whispered, "Boss, did you check the trunk of the car?" Schultz frowned. They walked down to the garage. Inside the trunk, they found a single item, a floral wreath with a card that read, "Deepest Sympathies. October 23rd, 1935, 19 Saunders, the Palace Chop House, Newark." The Palace Chop House was a relic of a different era, dark mahogany walls, brass railings, and the smell of roasting meat. It was a mob joint's paradise. Plenty of exits, a basement for hiding product, and a staff that knew how to keep their mouths shut. Schultz, Landau, Rosenkrantz, and Berman took their seats in the back room. The atmosphere was somber. Schultz was distracted, his eyes constantly darting to the door. He had left Elena at the safe house under guard, but her words haunted him. "You're just a loud noise." "Let's get the numbers over with," Schultz said, gesturing to the ledgers. He needed the distraction of business. Berman began to drone on about the week's take from the Bronx numbers racket. For a few hours, it felt like normal life. They ate steaks, drank whiskey, and argued about percentages. But outside, the Newark night was closing in. At 22 Haun, Schultz stood up. "I need to use the head." He walked down the narrow hallway toward the restroom. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. It was the same feeling he'd had in his kitchen 3 nights ago, the feeling of being watched. He entered the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror. He saw a man who was 43 years old but looked 60. He saw the grey in his hair and the frantic light in his eyes. "I'm Dutch Schultz," he whispered to the glass. "I'm the Dutchman." Outside the bathroom door, the world changed. 2 men entered the front of the restaurant. They didn't look like diners. They wore long overcoats despite the heat of the restaurant. One of them was Charlie Workman. The other was Mendy Weiss. They didn't say a word. They didn't ask for a table. They walked straight toward the back room. The bartender saw them and ducked behind the counter. He knew the look of the bug. It was the look of an ending. Workman reached the back room first. He didn't see Schultz. He saw Landau, Rosenkrantz, and Berman. He pulled a .45 and opened fire. But it was the sound from the bathroom, the sound of the door opening, that made him turn. October 23rd, 1935, 22:15, the back room. The first volley of bullets hit Otto Berman. The accountant, the man of logic, was the first to fall. He never saw the probability of his own death coming. He slumped over the ledger, his blood staining the very numbers he had spent his life calculating. Abe Landau and Lulu Rosenkrantz reacted with the speed of seasoned soldiers. They pulled their guns and returned fire, turning the back room into a slaughterhouse of flying splinters and cordite smoke. Schultz stepped out of the bathroom just as Workman turned the corner. Time seemed to slow down. Schultz saw the muzzle of Workman's gun. He saw the cold, empty eyes of the man who had been in his garden. The window was unlatched, Schultz thought. Workman fired. A single bullet struck Schultz in the side, just below the ribs. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was devastating. The impact knocked Schultz back into the bathroom, his body slamming against the porcelain sink. "Finish him," Weiss yelled from the hallway, struggling with his own weapon, which had jammed. Workman stepped toward the bathroom, but Landau, bleeding from multiple wounds, lunged at him. The two men grappled in the narrow hallway, a desperate, silent struggle for control of the gun. This brief distraction gave Schultz a moment. He didn't run. He crawled. He reached for his .38, which had fallen under the sink. His fingers brushed the cold steel. In the back room the silence returned, broken only by the heavy breathing of dying men. Rosenkrantz was on the floor, coughing blood. Landau was slumped against the wall, his eyes glazed. Workman and Weiss, seeing their work was nearly done, and hearing the sirens of the Newark police in the distance, turned and fled into the night. They left behind a room of ghosts. Schultz managed to pull himself up. He staggered back into the dining room, clutching his side. The few patrons who hadn't fled stared in horror. He looked like a man made of red ink. "A doctor!" Schultz gasped. "Get me a doctor!" As the police arrived, they found Schultz sitting at a table, clutching a blood-soaked napkin. But he wasn't asking for a lawyer. He was rambling. He was talking to people who weren't there, and he was saying things that would keep the FBI busy for decades. October 24, 1935, AO2 Banks, Newark City Hospital. The hospital room was guarded by a dozen police officers. Schultz lay on the bed, his skin a sickly yellow. The bullet had perforated his gallbladder and intestines. Peritonitis was setting in, a slow, agonizing death by infection. In the 1930s, there were no antibiotics. There was only morphine and time. A police stenographer sat by the bed, his pen poised over a notebook. Schultz began to speak. It wasn't a confession. It was a stream of consciousness, a fever dream of a dying king. "French-Canadian bean soup," Schultz muttered. "I want to pay. Let them leave me alone." The detectives leaned in. "Who shot you, Dutch? Was it Luciano? Was it Workman?" Schultz's eyes rolled back in his head. The sidewalk was slippery. She was meeting the man behind the kitchen. Elena. She knew. The house was cold. He talked for hours. He spoke of the big store, of hidden gold, and of the man with the velvet hat. To the police it sounded like gibberish, but to those who knew the underworld, he was listing names, dates, and locations. He was dumping his mental ledger before the ink dried forever. "Mother is the best help," he whispered. "I love my girl. Don't let them take the numbers. The numbers are the only thing that's real." Back at the safe house, the police found Elena. She wasn't hiding. She was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. When they told her Schultz was dying, she didn't cry. "Is my son safe?" she asked. The officer looked confused. "We don't know anything about a son, ma'am. We found the house empty." Elena closed her eyes. She realized then that the man in the charcoal overcoat had lied. There was no son. There was only the leverage. They had used her love to kill a man who, in his own twisted way, had trusted her. As Schultz entered his final hour, he suddenly sat bolt upright in bed. His eyes cleared for a second. He looked at the detective and said, "You can't catch a ghost with a net. Tell Dewey I'll see him in hell. I'm buying the first round." October 24, 1935, 1850, Newark City Hospital. Dutch Schultz died 22 hours after being shot. His last words were recorded as, "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim." He died as he lived, violent, confused, and surrounded by enemies. But his death was only the beginning of the effect lender. Within weeks, rumors began to circulate about the Schultz fortune. People claimed that before he left for Newark, he had buried an iron box containing $7 million in cash and bonds somewhere in the Catskill Mountains. The ghost of the Dutchman became a permanent fixture of New York crime law. Thousands of treasure hunters have spent decades digging up the woods of Phoenicia, New York, looking for the iron box. They never found it. Elena vanished. Some say she was taken out by the syndicate to tie up loose ends. Others say she was given a new life in the Midwest, a final thank you from Luciano for her role in removing the Dutchman. The Palace Chop House became a landmark of infamy. The holes in the mahogany walls were kept for years, as a grim souvenir of the night the beer baron fell. But the real legacy was the silence. After Schultz, the commission ruled with a quiet corporate efficiency. No more loud wars in the streets. No more hits on prosecutors. They learned from Schultz's mistake. The moment you become a legend, you become a target. Schultz thought he was playing a high-stakes game of strategy. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he forgot the oldest rule of the city. You're only as safe as the person who cleans your floors. The betrayal didn't start in a boardroom or a dark alley. It started behind a kitchen stove, with a trembling hand and a cream-colored envelope. The Dutchman saw the truth too late. By the time he noticed the unlatched window, the cold air was already in the house. The end of a titan, the start of a myth.